Well, welcome everyone. My name is Archit Jain. I'm one of the advisory board members here at ArcLight Summit, and I'm a lighting designer in Los Angeles. And today I have two good friends from Los Angeles, Lauren Dandridge and Nick Albert, and they're going to talk about putting allyship in practice. So I'll give you a brief introduction for both of them. Lauren Dandridge is a 17-year veteran in the lighting industry with a portfolio of award-winning projects across the country. She is principal of Chromatic, a lighting design firm that promotes lighting quality and equality for all communities while pursuing intelligent and beautiful design. Lauren is also an adjunct assistant professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California, where she teaches architectural lighting. Her students have gone on to successful lighting careers in prominent lighting design firms across the country.
Like
and we have a couple of Lauren students in our firm too. So I'll take ourselves as prominent lighting design firms. Nick Albert is a 20-year veteran of the lighting, architecture, and construction industries and principal at Chromatic. He has hundreds of built works across the globe and awards and recognition in both the US and international lighting communities. Please join me in welcoming Lauren and Nick.
Thank you, Archit.
Thank you, Archit. Thank you, everybody, for coming late in the day, late in the program. And everybody may be a little logy after lunch, so appreciate you still showing up. Hopefully you hit the coffee stand like we did on the way up. We're excited to be here and to talk about something that's really sort of personal to us and important to us in our practice of lighting design. And that's the idea of allyship and how we can help that be manifest in our work. This is our experience that we're going to talk about a little bit today. It's a lot about what we've experienced as we've gone through the process of starting our firm and starting it with this sort of idea behind it. So this isn't meant to be the sort of definitive list of allyship or the end of the story in any regard. It's a work in progress from our standpoint as we work through it, and we think it's important to sort of share some of those stories and some of those ideas, and whether they've worked or whether they haven't. So we're excited to share that with you and to sort of talk a little bit more.
And thank you,
about that.
Cindy in the back, for having us here to present these items.
Yeah.
That's us.
That's us. The AIA has something to say about this, that you will learn things, and they approve of that, so that's great. Those things, from a learning standpoint, again, from our stories and from the examples that we're going to share, what we would really encourage you to try to think about and to take from this is confronting inequitable practices that make allyship necessary to begin with, to start to define for yourself, or maybe define from our experience, what some effective allyship strategies are, specifically, you know, in lighting design and in a commercial space, but also in a personal space. Start to recognize how you can implement strategies in the workplace and in business, and we would encourage everybody to evaluate their own role and where they feel like they live in this space as either an ally or as an allied person within their own company, within the industry. From that, again, just, you know, coming from our experience, and maybe using it to think about your own.
And how that intersects with your whole life too, not just, oh, this allyship business works really well when I'm inside the four walls of my office, but how can you then make that applicable to your friendships and other wider networks?
Right. So the idea of allyship, the word allyship, it's something that's talked about a lot more recently than it has been. It's an idea that's been around for a long time, obviously, but it's really come to the forefront, I think, of the social conversation more in the last few years. You know, it's something that you see a lot in the news, you hear about a lot when people are talking, and it's something that people generally support, I think, the idea of allyship in general. And a lot of folks are excited to be an ally. And, you know, at the very basic level, you're talking about supportive association with another person or group in general terms, specifically as it relates to social justice, as it relates to social groups. It's association, but with members of marginalized or underrepresented groups to which one doesn't belong. So it's someone from some group associating and aligning themselves with marginalized or underrepresented folks from another group. It's actually, you know, so prevalent in the conversation that it was the word of the year last year, right? It's very much present in everyday life. Everybody is sort of talking about that, and I think a lot of folks are excited about it and the idea of it, but questions come from that too, right? So, you know, allyship sounds great, but what the heck is an ally? Why is that actually important? You know, why be an ally? This is a modern world. Do we even need allies? These are some of the questions that I think naturally come from these things. And I think the question that really landed for us also is how do I ally? What does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? So again, the story, I think, of how we started Chromatic and how we started our firm together really comes from some of these conversations and really comes from the origins of these ideas and how we apply them to our life. You know, the idea of trying to build a culture of equity in what we do, of equity and allyship, right? The place that I think this conversation has been the most robust so far is in the social media space. I think that kind of amplification of ideas is also why it's the word of the year. It's why we see the word allyship everywhere. It's why it's such a presence in all conversations, especially in social justice conversations. And I think that's a great service to the idea, and you know, it is a real value to spreading it, but
there's also a lot of safety in social media allyship, right? Like, you can post something, you can like something, you can heart something, you can support something, but as we'll talk about in a second, the action beyond that isn't really determined, right? The action was in fact that click, and now you get to feel good about yourself because you did the right thing by showing somebody that you supported a post.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's a lot of how, you know, I started down this path. It's a lot of how that people come to the ideas of it, but then it's sort of like getting stuck, right? It's sort of understanding like what happens after the post, what happens after the click, what happens after the thumbs up, right? How do you do something more than that? And you know, we think there's something more to it, right? I think the other side of that too is because of its prevalence, because of the rate at which it's talked about, you know, allyship, especially when taken on by corporate entities, tends to be transitioned into a bit of into a marketing exercise. Allyship has a tendency to become a marketing idea rather than a justice or equity idea because of the way that it is talked about, because of the conversations around it. They sort of stop at support, and so it's relatively easy for a company even to just say support, show support, you know, pride flag the crap out of their website, you know, once a year, you know, to follow the months, right, the different months of the year on the social justice calendar, as it were, and it has a tendency, or there's the trap for it to become really just a marketing exercise and to become something that doesn't go beyond that. And again, you know, in our discussions, we're compelled that there has to be something more to it than that, right? There has to be something different than just stopping at posting, liking, and, you know, some branding stuff once in a while. So the story of Chromatic and us together really, as we alluded to earlier, is born from moments of allyship. We've both been in the industry a long time. We've been colleagues for a long time and friends for a long time. And, you know, we kind of came together as friends first in these discussions, I think in earnest, mostly around the time of George Floyd, and just sort of flailing around trying to find somebody to talk to and trying to just communicate and understand and think about that. And quite frankly, even in a room full of lighting designers, kind of asking what the heck are we doing with lights? Like when there's like, you know, real problems in the world, like, you know, what is it that we're doing, and why is that important?
It's hard to remember how much pressure there was in the summer of 2020. There was, you know, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then like person after person after person, and just the awfulness of everything that just kept happening. And I think you called me and I was like, who gives a shit about lights? Like, people are dying. You know, I said that out loud and was like, I've wasted my whole life. Like, you know, it just felt like everything felt so small, and that this quote unquote expertise that I had was not being used to make the world a better place in any kind of way, because, oh, you have a downlight. Good for you. And I just sort of want to really talk about that, because just the internal strife of everybody having this unspoken pressure of like being unsure whether we should talk about it, and should I say something, or do you want to talk about it? I'm uncomfortable. Are you uncomfortable? Like that whole atmosphere almost has completely pivoted and like gone away now, you know, 2 years later, plus the pandemic, plus, you know, the president being who he was, and, you know, just like everything was hard that year.
There were a lot of reasons to question why the heck we were putting down lights in ceilings, right? There are a lot in there, but what we, through a lot of talking, a lot of phone time, a lot of, you know, face-to-face, more than a few visits to the bar, I will admit, through a lot of discussion and just good friendship, you know, one of the things that we came back to is that there was this really beautiful synergy between all of these things that we're recognizing in the world and the sort of lack or need for humanity, right? And thinking about people as people, and just sort of the humanity or inhumanity of what was going on, and kind of coming back to our shared design principles when we talk about lighting as a human environment. I mean, Lauren's heard it a million times. My soapbox is that your building doesn't care if it has lights, right? We do this thing, we put lights in buildings, and there is no reason except for people for there to be lights in those spaces. So what lighting design is an entirely human endeavor. It is about human experience, and that's the end of it. And all of these other things that we were identifying as important in the world are also about human experience. And so for us, it became, you know, without being too grandiose, it became this idea of there is synergy. We are sort of focused on what we do, have our eye on the prize. And then we also started to notice through those discussions that there's a lot of power in similar but different experiences. We are two people. If you're talking about ally and allied, we are like the poster children for allyship, I guess. But like, we had very specific sort of, I'll say, demographics related to that conversation. And what we started to notice was the value of what was happening. And it might have even been later that we even sort of like identified it as allyship. But we started this really natural process of sort of exploring those things from places of being the same and of being different.
So when we started trying to figure out how to smush all of that into a business, we stepped away for a second and said, okay, here's the things I'm really good at, here's the things that need work, here's what's important to me, here's sort of what I believe to be my core sort of human things, and here, you know, Nick is there. So, you know, I grew up in Baltimore, super city. If anybody's seen The Wire, that's not the version of Baltimore I grew up in, but it's not far off, you know. And I don't ever think we have a conversation where Nick doesn't mention some sort of Midwestern something about
casserole
or potatoes, or, you know, things like that. And we have lots of conversations that started off for a long time really uncomfortable about our different perspectives and where we were coming from. And I feel very certain that I can say Nick has not had to endure as many conversations about black hair in life since becoming my business partner and us traveling together. when we were in Oregon at a wine lounge, like we were designing a wine lounge, and between the airport arrival and then return back to Los Angeles, I think maybe like 10 different people stopped to talk to me and basically ignored Nick altogether, and he just leaned in and was like, "Do this many people talk to you about your hair?" I'm like, yes they do. And then, you know, and then all of the other sorts of very intimate and very specific to a Black woman items that happened to me around my hair, like people wanting to touch it, asking me about it, asking me to explain my whole like maintenance and washing schedule, telling me about the person that they went to college with who also had lots and how they, you know, like that whole thing. So those types of conversations started coming up. We also talked about what it means to be a mom versus a dad, and how that time, the time and requirements on me, I believe, would be different than him, and could we support each other that way? If I'm in the middle of something and I get a call from school because I'm the primary person, and like, can you handle me literally having to get up and walk out? Not that dads don't have to do that, but I'm the primary person all the time. And we took all of that information, and I went and wrote like a Word document that had a couple paragraphs of what I thought to be like the core essence of what we were getting ready to do. And then Nick came in hot with a whole keynote presentation that was, I kid you not, 40 slides. And I was like, oh, I am not prepared the same way at all for this. And in all of that, I mean, and it's funny and it's mucky and it's the uncomfortable stuff of being a whole human that really allowed us to try and figure out what we wanted Chromatic to be. And it had to be a place where I could be all of those things and he can be all of those things, and there's still room to grow and be smushy and malleable as life continues to push and pull you. And so how can lighting be a part of that? Well, we can talk about it. We can talk about it in the context of starting a business. We can talk about how the environments in which people are living their lives, doing all of these things, how is the lighting supporting that? And then the idea started to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I usually do at least 30 pages of a keynote for a new idea, but the reason we got to 40 plus is what we started to tap into, I think, is a kind of momentum about the connections and about how we could really use this idea of connection, as vague as that is and as unrelated to lighting design as that is, as a way of orienting our business practice and the way that we do our work. We're good at what we do, at least as good as Archit, but we're good at what we do. Not as good as Archit. We're good at what we do, but how do we do it is the question, right? We don't need to know lighting. We know lighting design. We don't need to solve those problems with a new company, but can we talk about these other things? And it really became it's important to note that at this point the name Chromatic didn't exist. We did all of this sort of absent of that particular direction, and from that direction, with some really excellent help that we'll talk about later, this idea of Chromatic came out and really became this kind of a conversation. This kind of support became central to that model and really to that identity, right? It's chromatic and it's giving light to the human experience, right? It's lighting, but it's also all of these other things, and it has that right there at the front door. And this comes from this idea, and that I really love, that action expresses priority. Like, how you tell the world what you're about is by showing them what you do. Some people have much better quotable versions of this, but our sort of in-house version is you have to take care of your corner of the shop. So when we're flailing around in those years trying to figure out what we're doing and why it matters and how that relates to these big, serious problems you see on the news every day, it came back to, like what my grandpa taught me, like, take care of your corner of the shop first. You start there, and then you work out from that. And our corner of the shop is the lighting design industry. It's where we have, all of our connections. It's what we do. It's where we touch the most lives. It's where we have the biggest sphere of influence. It's where we have the opportunities to share these stories the most. And so we started from there to develop an approach to this, okay? So going back and reflecting on it, because it's always a work in progress, we kind of broke it into these 3 phases, or these 3 sort of sequences in how we sort of approach it, right? So the first is acknowledging and accepting what's out there in the world. It's reframing conversations or reframing ideas or biases, opening minds. And then the most critical part is finding out how to make that actionable after that. It's scary. There's always risks to action. It's uncomfortable, and I love the phrase uncomfortable inaction, right? I like that as a way of describing the gravity to caring but not doing, the gravity to like, I know this is important, but it's hard to do. It can be really scary, but also we think worthwhile. So that first piece, acknowledgement, calling it what it is, those first conversations for us were specific to mostly race. Like those early examples for our experience of allyship and supporting were not comfortable, and they were based around race, and they were based around what we were seeing and having that discussion. So it took some real, often uncomfortable acknowledgement of things, right? It takes certain acknowledgement that racism exists. It sounds like a simple idea, but it's sometimes difficult to understand, and that it's systemic, that it exists, and it's part of everything that I know, that you know, that we know. It's just there. It was also a really challenging process to sort of acknowledge and accept that privilege exists in that same context, or as the counterpoint to that, and that benefits those of privilege, right? These aren't easy things to say. Like even sometimes, like as much as we talk about this stuff, it still sort of stops at the tongue a little bit. It's hard to get out sometimes, because those ideas they're difficult. They're hard to talk about. They're maybe not spoken of enough, or maybe not talked about frankly enough. But that sort of like clear acknowledgement was what we found to be so important, because acknowledging in that way, in a sort of neutral way, opened the door to acceptance of things that might have had some innate resistance to, or might have like, no, that's not a problem anymore, or that's not this, or that doesn't affect me, or whatever, right? It softened and it opened the path to just accepting things for what they are. Acceptance has a really wonderful side effect of making things unemotional at some point. So now those words and those ideas aren't as charged as they were. So conversation's easier to have because you don't have all that emotional content built up in it, right? Because it's just sort of like taking a more neutral tact in your own thinking.
And it's also depersonalizing it.
Yeah.
Right? So the second that you accept these as like general facts like gravity or things like that, it doesn't make it about you and how you are affected by all of these things. Although there is a definite self component to it, but that's not the sort of systemic larger issue we're trying to address.
Yeah, exactly. And then that now you're thinking about it more rationally, and once you get to that point, you can actually start thinking about solutions. You can actually start thinking about practical things, right? And that sort of path, those sort of foundations really, we found, again, stumbling into a lot of this stuff really became the bedrock of how we could have conversations about moving forward. And to get there, though, takes a lot of self-education and supported education. Thank you.
Thank you. It goes both ways.
It does, and that's really important to understand. I think that then you've sort of like framed a reality for yourself, and then you also have to be responsible to that reality, rather than just saying, "Here's this world. I've accepted it. I've acknowledged it, but I'm not responsible for it." Right? That was part of our path. And again, I think Lauren touched on it a little bit. Being very, very sure that you are not self-defining the parameters, right? So when you're talking about allyship, and just going to take an aside here to say that most of this comes from education, right? So most of this comes from a lot of really smart people that we talk to, listen to, read, and all that kind of stuff. These ideas are out there in the world. This is sort of a compilation. But one of the things that really resonated was to make sure that you're not self-defining those big ideas, those realities that you're accepting, but that you are making sure that what you are accepting is recognized to those who you're allying with. right? Like, it can't be my version of racism. It has to be the real version of racism. If I am the, if something else, if I am not the marginalized person, I have to accept the reality of that person, or I am not their ally. I have to accept that version of it because that's the one that's relevant if I am trying to be an ally. And one of the things that I thought was really beautifully said by friends that we've had these conversations with is that it's not that she said, it's not that I convinced you, it's that you heard me. That was what was so important, right? It's not that that person had to, stand up and shout and convince me that it needed to be done. It's that I heard what that person was saying and I acted on that, right? And that's a different kind of acceptance. Or maybe that is just acceptance, but that's a different way of sort of like, working at it, and a different way of coming to it. So some of this we've already talked about, but kind of the real sort of snippet, kind of, we'll call it case study of this is the experience that we're talking about of us forming, of us working together. The conversations that we had took a lot of listening and speaking from a place of acknowledgement. That's why that acknowledgement piece is so important, is that you have to be able to listen from a place of acknowledgement, and you will hear things differently. You have to be able to speak from a place of acknowledgement because you will frame those conversations differently, and then you're moving the needle. We had to kind of come to this idea that structural inequity is a reality, and everybody has to accept that. I mean, people that, on either side, either privileged or not, within that inequity, have to accept that it's real. I mean, I think that there's a lot of cases where folks just don't want to believe that that's still an issue, don't want to believe that that's a problem, but because that puts every single thing in life. If you accept, once you accept that it's structural or it's societal, now every single thing is sort of in question from what you thought it was yesterday, and that's really, really hard. And that takes a lot of work.
The story, the very, very first time Nick and I sort of had, I would say, probably the most open conversation was after we had been friends for many years, and we had gone on a spec trip, had fun, and then we were back in Los Angeles at a bar having, cocktails and just sort of chatting, and he revealed that, they were looking to adopt, and that it was no particular race for the children they were looking to adopt. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, I know that the foster care system and adoption agencies have predominantly a ton of kids of color, and that the likelihood that Nick is going to get a black or brown baby is pretty high. And I'm sitting here not having had any conversation. We never actually said the words black or brown or white to each other. And now I feel some kind of way about making sure that this potential, African American or black baby that he may or may not get has support from that community inside that household. And I very specifically said to Nick, okay, we are about to broach a topic and we are going to become friends now. Not just colleagues and not just friendly colleagues, but I'm about to say things to you that means that you can no longer punish me as a salesperson because I'm about to say something that might be difficult, which is that if you adopt a black baby, you should make sure you have black people around your black baby, and I will be one of them. And then from there, and from that incredibly very clear line in the sand where I had decided to stop essentially being colorless in our conversations and make a verbal acknowledgement of my own background and upbringing, we then became really closer in being able to have conversations like that, because it was very awkward. I sat there, he was probably like, what is she doing? And I was probably going through all the machinations and about what are the positives and negatives of this outcome by me introducing this new topic between us in a professional setting. Because the last time I had even cracked a joke about that, I had gotten put in my place by the white person by saying, I don't see color, I don't see race. And I was like, oh, this isn't okay. we're not going to do that. Like, this is not acceptable here. Now, I was much younger and I didn't really have anything to say back to that. And now here I am introducing it to a colleague. So having openness, having empathy, having also an awareness that, like, it's structural inequity that allowed me to be able to say that, because had, you know, if all kids were adopted at the same rates, then I probably wouldn't have had a reason to sort of personalize that conversation. And that, honestly, is the actual, like, little teeny tiny kernel that became Chromatic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, openness, honesty, all of that, but I would say on Lauren's part, I mean, extreme courage to be in that moment and bring that up, which gave me then the courage to ask questions that I wouldn't have been comfortable asking prior to that. Gave me courage to have some of those discussions, and that really, you know, I mean, you know, she deserves the credit for taking that first step, but the point is that it's sort of, they support each other, right? Like, in that, and that moment created the possibility for all of those other moments. But you know, this whole part of this whole first piece, you have to take a lot of care when you do this too, I think. And this is a lot of feedback that we read, we hear, we tell each other, like, we give each other these kind of feedbacks as well. I think once you start into the acknowledgement path, you have to be really careful about performative allyship. I think that's also a phrase that's become a lot more common to hear. And that, you know, that has to do with allyship, which just sort of stops at the water's edge of action, right? That's allyship, which is, and again, nothing wrong with it. I think that the social media thing is the perfect example, right? Everybody changes their thing during certain months of the year. They change their background. They put up support. They applaud things. That's great, and it does get you to the water's edge. But, like, at some point, you got to stick your toe in the water, and it's scary. But till then, you're not swimming, right? So until you stick a toe in the water, and if it just continues that way, it becomes a little bit performance-based. It can be seen as virtue signaling. Look how awesome I am. Look at all the things that I support, right? That's another, I think, trap that people fall into. It's difficult to decide where that line is and decide where that helpful is. I think something else that, especially in the design community, and I would say architecture, interior design, master planning, lighting design, all of these trades, typically, I would say people have a tendency to be of the mind of, like, ideas can solve problems, ideas can save the world or make the world a better place. Once you cross into a lot of these sort of social justice and equity issues, you have to be very, very careful of unconsciously creating a victim-savior dynamic. I mean, that's actually something that we sort of, like, we check against our own design work all the time. You know, when we come into a place with, like, let's say a master plan street lighting design, are we coming in as the, you know, the lighting design saviors that are going to do all this fancy stuff that community doesn't actually need or want, right? So we can understand that, I think, from a design standpoint, but when you're talking about allyship, you have to be very, very careful of creating those victim-savior dynamics. Inaction for fear, that comes to the water's edge comment, right? Like, just not doing something because it's scary or because you're afraid of doing something wrong. I was in that space for a long, long time, scared to death that I was going to do or say something wrong, especially with people that were important to me. And that prevented me from having conversations. And then also, we have to be very mindful of the responsibility of the onlys. A lot is put on the onlys, and because inequities are so inherent in all of our systems, there are a lot of spaces where the only then bears the responsibility of creating these opportunities, when the only at an office has to then be the DEIR expert, or when the only at the office has to be the one that develops and supports everybody else's journey in this regard. That is a lot of responsibility and stress that can turn into a lot of hostility. And so it's really important, I think, to make sure, I mean, there's some things you're only going to find out from asking questions of the onlys, and that's just part of it, I think, but it's something to be really sensitive about, right? Something that somebody else said to us is you have to find the space to understand that you can't know what it is to be me, you just have to understand my needs. And that's part of that idea, right? Let's not, I will never be able to know exactly what it is to be Lauren in her life, in her experience, but I have to be able to listen without changing what she's saying to me to be able to what she needs. And that's really moves to reframing your thinking, right? Thinking about things differently, opening your mind. How are we doing on time?
We're good.
Good. So you move into this sort of next phase of it, and now you're listening and hearing things differently. You're having different kinds of dialogues that are more constructive, that are moving the needle to a different place.
And side note, like I just want to interject here because USC is very, very big on diversity, equity, inclusion, and using all of this kind of language. And I can say that all of these talking points and these lectures are really for people, and I'm not trying to sound ageist at all, but are for people who are older than emerging professionals, because the students that are in my classes are so clearly in this mindset already. And they are coming to class demanding more of that clarity of language, asking more of the curriculum, asking more of the faculty, asking more of the administration. And I will speak about myself now. For me, as an older person in this scenario now, I have to be really good at listening because I sit on the faculty calls, which are now Zooms, and I hear the faculty struggling with trying to get around the language, and they say, well, how do we know how far we've come? How do we have markers for progress? How do we do all this? And the students are just like, if we're still here talking to you about it, then that means we haven't gone far enough, period. And that doesn't work for a lot of people who need like evidence-based like facts for moving forward. How do I know I've done the right thing? How do I know I've allied correctly? We've made so many more gains. We have this many more students of color. We have this many more faculty of color. And the students are just like, yeah, but we still only learn about all white male architects. We still only hear about all white male, planners. We still have, all of these other things. So for the students and for, I would say, the younger people coming into our industry, this open mindset isn't actually something they're working on. It is already ingrained as part of their DNA in a way.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really wonderful opportunity too, right? And I think that, a lot of what we're talking about here is personal, but a lot of what we're talking about here is how an organization comes into these sort of understandings as well, and to make space for those emerging professionals. I mean, to make space for the conversations that should have happened and can still happen. It's really about listening and hearing differently. It's about changing the way that the vocabulary is used. So spaces should be safe, they should be supportive for dialogue. Lots of uncomfortable conversations can happen, but you don't have to leave the table uncomfortable if everybody's supporting the conversation. Uncreating systems that might be part of that systemic inequity, or at least thinking about it, like this is the standard way we do this, or this is the industry standard for that. Well, those standards are part of a larger system, which is part of a larger thing, which is part of the overall inequity, right? So thinking about all of those steps or all of those standards or those norms, and do I need to uncreate that? Do I need to address that?
And that's beyond sort of, I know the context of our conversation is very race heavy, but that goes beyond just race. That goes beyond, for example, people who go out to the golf courses are more likely to get promotions, right? That goes beyond the people who get the promotions aren't the ones who've had to take 6 or 8 months off to nurse a baby or take care of an older parent or things like that. Any sort of like whole humanist part of you that has not been able to be included because it was something other than the majority.
Yeah, and then, and owning your mistakes, being proactive, do a little bit every day, right? It's
like vitamins?
Vitamins, it's like going to the gym, right? You got to do a little bit every day. Listen to an array of voices, that's really important, right? Don't get in echo chambers, whether they're well-intended echo chambers or not. And challenge your own biases. Why do I think this? Is that the right, it's kind of like challenging the standards. And really, like, don't be afraid to step forward and definitely speaking personally here, stepping in it often and always, and you just got to figure out how to clean your shoe off and move on. So there's just a beautiful, we think, case of this that comes from our beginning.
So, you heard the story of how Nick and I first, were allowed to be our whole ethnic selves after the conversation about adoption. And we started having these incredibly emotional and charged conversations during the summer of 2020, and then trying to figure out how that tied into lighting. And we hired a brand identity company to help us sort of figure out the name that we wanted, the colors that we wanted to be associated with. How do you take all of these incredibly large ideas and put it in a logo? Like, it's taken us an hour to just talk about our partnership, right? And like, here's a logo, right? Yeah. And this company is two principals and a younger designer, and they're very diversity, equity, inclusion interested and driven, and members of different kinds of communities. And we sat there and did all of these Zooms. We gave them all of our decks. We were like, these are what's important to us. These are things. And bless their hearts, they took all of this information and distilled it down to like names and like a sentence. And we're like, well, that's amazing. You're really good at this. And what happened is, so we eventually chose the name Chromatic at this point, and we were like, this is great, giving light to the human experience. It's about light, it's about giving, it's about different colors and illumination. It's great. And so we were in the process of choosing the font for our logo. And we, I don't know, maybe had like 3 or 4 of them up, and it was the same company that took all this information and condensed it down to a sentence. I mean, they're amazing, so everything looked great. And at the very end, again, the younger designer of the group said, we're glad you like these. There's this other one I want to show you. Principle number 1 wasn't really, didn't necessarily want to show you, but I think you'll really like it. And we were like, okay, whatever. And so it pops up and it has this like overlaying of like letters and transparency and shapes and forms. We're like, this looks amazing. We were like, why didn't you want to show us? And the principal number 1 said, well, I didn't want you to think that we were pushing an agenda on you, because, can you go to the next slide? Because the font is actually named after Gilbert Baker. He is the original designer of the Pride flag. And I didn't want you thinking that I was pushing some sort of agenda on you or your company, or that you would be sort of forced to represent things beyond what you were comfortable with. So the original font actually looks like this. And if you can see, it is incredibly dynamic. It has these levels of transparency and overlap. I mean, it inherently lends itself to a lighting correlation, right? Like, you can see things beyond other things. And we were like, okay. And then if you go to what ours actually looks like, it takes the essence of that and distills it down to, what we need for drafting, but then also for the colors that are important to our brand identity. And in that conversation, principle number 1 said, I didn't want you to think I was pushing my agenda or an agenda. Principle number 2 said, well, you don't have to talk about it. Like, you don't have to have or say the association with Gilbert, which is the name of the font now. And then Nick, because of all of the conversations we had, said, well, actually the conversation we should be having is this appropriation? Neither one of us are direct members of that community. How should we use this? Is it something, are we appropriating something that was meant for another group? And then meanwhile, I'm in the background like, we should be talking about this. We should be telling people who Gilbert is. We should be talking about these things. We should have a link in our signatures that says how amazing all of these things are. Because yes, of course, we're not members of the community, but we are parts of, we are supporters of that community. We're supporters of all the people. And if this isn't exactly what this whole point is about, then why are we even having this conversation? And in a 15-minute window, we had a conversation about how a font and a logo had a whole meaning behind allyship, support, self-censorship, because you were concerned about how your own identity might be influencing other people, fear that might not be accepted, or somehow the person you thought was as progressive as you turns out they might not be. And it became an actual embodiment of not just the perspective that we have, but the process of how we go about doing it. And that's so when we talk about systemic and structural changes, going all the way back to a font, you all won't know that story, but if you ask us, we can tell you. If you go to our website, you can see it. And while that has nothing directly to do with lighting, it does have a lot to do with how we practice lighting.
Right. And, you know, and what that did for us, again, really early on in this, is that planted the flag. That was the proof of the theorem. That was the moment where we saw the huge potential of this kind of allyship, of a company, a business, where this is the direction. Because it's 100% the right choice for us, no matter what the provenance of that font is. It's 100% right. Add the story, it's even 1,000% right, right? Like it was all of the right design choices, business choices, and almost didn't happen because that was the old way of doing things.
Yeah.
But this sort of approach made the space for that conversation. And dare I say, I mean, it entirely changed the trajectory of what we're doing.
Yeah.
I've spoken, we're good friends with that firm. It changed the trajectory of what they do in their practice as well. One little conversation, one little decision at the very beginning of everything. And we have seen that start to multiply as well. Those conversations, you move those into building design and lighting design and space design. You move those into a space with an architect and an interior designer and an owner and a municipality, and now all of a sudden you're actually talking about these kind of stakes where what we had hoped in the beginning was to find ways to make things different. That was the turning point for us in a really small but beautiful way, right? I think that.
And it showed proof that you can ally, like that was a multi-directional set of ally-shipping, right? Like I am supporting Nick in his questioning of appropriation. We're supporting the firm by one of them being concerned about even bringing it up, the other one being more concerned about whether to even use it. Like, I smile so hard when I think about that because it was just proof that with patience and like enough understanding, something really, really magnificent can come out of it.
Yeah, and just being mindful of that and taking care with it. That's a lot of, I think, possibility, and if it's done right and done well, I think it really builds and it really fosters growth. That's pretty exciting, right? It's important, you know, one of the things that we hear a lot, that we've heard from some folks, is that it's important that they speak their vision in their own words, right? So it's important that the space is made for people to bring their own version and their own words and their own communication to the space. And the job of the ally in those cases is to make the space, to support the space, to open the dialogue and to hear those words. And that's really where you shift into the phase of action, right? So, you know, because an ally might have more privileges in a certain space or in a community and then recognizes those because that's the path of allyship, now what you're creating is the opportunity to be a really powerful voice alongside oppressed voices, right? Okay.
Yeah, so what allyship can do, it isn't giving another rock that's the exact same size like on the left. It's recognizing that, oh, if this other person needs a second rock or a different kind of rock, then that's great. We can help make everybody have as good of a vantage point as possible. But ultimately, what all of this talking, all of this lecturing, all of this effort, all of this research, all of this allyship is there for is to get rid of the need for the rocks in the first place. The barriers that are there are the things we're exactly trying to get rid of. It's what we're working around it right now because we don't have all of the tools, all of the information yet to break that fence down. But once we do, that's the goal.
And that journey, it's important to remember that journey takes the people, you know, for whom the fence obscures the future, and that takes also the people that can see past that fence. You can't start to dismantle that fence in this diagram unless you have both of those things.
Yeah.
And it takes those two working together, right? And you can argue whether that should have ever been the case in the first place, but with where there's a fence. We're accepting reality.
Yeah.
There's a fence now, right? And so it really takes both of those parts.
So starting by, like Nick said at the beginning, acknowledgement, acceptance, And then action. So one of the other ways that allyship, I think, in person becomes really important is actually not ignoring when somebody else is being the opposite of an ally. And that is not relegated to one particular group. Like, I need to be an ally to another group over here. Nick needs to be my ally. I need to be his, in all different kinds of areas, because I don't know if anybody else has been in a scenario where something has happened in front of them, the pit of, like, you know it's happening and you don't say something, it feels worse afterwards, because not only did someone get hurt, not physically, but hurt, like, you didn't do anything about it. So now you have that crappy feeling of, I'm not a good person and someone got hurt, instead of coming to someone's aid, and the two of you can then share on that bond.
So in this space, action looks like, these are some examples, right? So actions and words count, what we do, what we say, what other people do, what they say. The Deloitte study that was up earlier says that whatever it was, 1 in 3 witness these things and don't say anything, or allow these things, not allow, but allow these things to move on and to continue. Using your privilege to signal openness and support is a really important step. There's a great little story that happened recently. You know, we do the pronouns on the business cards and on the email signatures, right? You do the, you know, so mine says Nick Albert, principal, he, him, his. It's on my email signature as well. And one day, out of the blue, for no reason, I got a call from a colleague that we're working on a project together. It was an older white man. So he related to me, and he just called and he said, "What's the deal with your signature?" And I'm thinking I sent it from the wrong email address or something like that. He's like, "What's going on with that?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, what's it say?" And eventually, like, I got him to say, he's like, "Well, why do you list pronouns? That doesn't make any sense to me. Why do you need that?" And it gave me the opportunity to explain why that's important, not necessarily to me and my experience, but using my position of privilege to signal that that's an okay conversation to have, or to show people that that's an appropriate thing. Whether this person didn't question my pronouns or not is irrelevant to the case, that I have the opportunity to do that, and the opportunity then to have that conversation, and that my position gave him the comfort enough to just call me out of we're not friendly, but he just called me out of the blue. He's like, "I don't know, that guy can tell me what's up because I relate to him in some sort of a way."
I mean, he didn't call me. We're both on the project, so.
Yeah, and he's like, and you know, it was a really nice conversation, and it just gave me the chance to explain why that's important to so many people, and why that's something that's worth doing, no matter whether people question it about me or not, right? And that it's a small thing, but those are the kind of things that I think really stand out as opportunities, especially to use privilege. You know, and I am in full acknowledgement that I am a white man, right? So when I'm talking about privilege, I'm talking about all of the different ways that is a privileged condition in the world, and trying to, you know, it creates opportunities, I think, which is really exciting, and a way to use that for something that's valuable. Calling out inappropriate behavior, becoming so someone said this to us, I love this turn of phrase, but collaborator, accomplice, and conspirator, right? So really working with, but in the spirit of collaboration, in the spirit of alongside, not doing things for people or to people to help save them, right? That's that savior complex. Accepting feedback. I have had to humble myself so many times, and that's not humility is not my natural instinct, so that's been a challenge for me personally, but it's always yielded better results. Asking how I can do better and what else I can do, and taking the advice, not rejecting it. And what I think is really important is to not be surprised when folks you're allying get tired, right? When they feel all of the pressure of your allyship, as well as all of the reasons that you are their ally in the first place. It's really important to remember that and to be sensitive to that.
So one of the things, again, back, not to make it about specifically just us, but anytime you have an only or double only, so like a woman of color in a place where it's all white men or things like that, so much of the responsibility of how the education gets done ends up falling on those people, and so it ends up being so much of a burden that people burn out, leave, don't stay, or ultimately just give up and assume the status quo.
Right, it should feel good, but be careful of doing it for audience or praise. Focus on impact rather than intent. That's really important. I think that there's a lot of well-intentioned allyship that just doesn't change things, it doesn't help things. This is a good example of that, and this is something that I think happens a lot, and it's, you know, in the fear, like when you witness something, you know, it's important not to come up after to give sympathy. It's important to give support in the moment.
Yeah.
And this is something really wonderful that we read, action as an individual, and sort of also, so taking that then and shifting it into coalition, right? And the place where this goes back to the take care of your corner of the shop, right? You can make the most difference in the place where you already spend most of your time and energy, where you already have the most influence with what it is that you do every day. I've read a couple of books by Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, and he's got, you know, he came into that company with a specific vision of making it a purpose-driven company, and it's one of the biggest companies in the world. So I think it's a really good proof of concept for how a company can have these ideas and prosper. And one of the things that always resonated for me is that people with purpose thrive. We all know that. Brands with purpose will grow, and companies with purpose will last. Right, so this is where you start taking all of these ideas and making the business case for it. And if anybody hasn't read it, he wrote a wonderful book called Net Positive recently that talks a lot about what it is that they're putting into the world and how they're making a difference. And you'll be blown away by the scale of challenges that they can tackle because of the size of the company and how specifically they can do it.
And Patagonia.
Yeah, the Patagonia thing
showed us this whole model. I mean, like, the most amazing way possible.
Yeah. So I think there is a business case to be made for it. I think if we go back to the young people thing too, yeah. I think the trend seems to be that younger folks don't accept this status quo. They're willing, or they only exist in a world where things should be different, and they're going to want to align themselves with brands, with companies, with goals, with people that do that as well. And that's what I think is so important here. You know, is shifting this all from an interpersonal discussion into a how is their business to be done here? How is it that the commercial and the business communities can also answer this call? Because, you know, that's where the most change is going to happen. Is if you can make a business case for it, you can get a lot of things done, right? And so it's taking it from that individual allyship, which is so very important, but then building a community of allies, right? It's the allied or allies of a group starting to look at the intersectional allyship opportunities. You know, nobody's just one group. Nobody is just one thing. And so looking at where all of those intersect and how a lot of the needs are the same, right? And how you can, is really powerful. Closing the opportunity gap between groups, and being bold, big goals, challenging assumptions, striving for positive change. Back to Paul for a minute, but the world we want is an enormous responsibility. And we think that it's an exciting opportunity to sort of take that responsibility on and try to do something with it, even if it's just in our little corner of the shop. Sorry to hold you guys late, but we appreciate it. And
Thank you.
We are, so there's, and I don't know how if they'll make this available to you. There's some citations and stuff here. We've got a really wonderful and robust reading list too, though, but like connect with us on LinkedIn or something, and we'll post the reading list so that you have a chance to look at it. But my whole bookshelf is full of this stuff now through this journey, and it's fascinating and exciting and really wonderful, and we think it's really wonderful that there's interest. So we really appreciate you guys being here, and we're happy to take any questions or field any thoughts, or just let you get the heck out of here, whatever your preference is.
Oh,
please.
Sure.
So it's been 1 year.
Thank you.
in this one year, looking at years prior to starting and looking at other products that are beginning to refer to past purpose, how has that affected the way you approach your work? How has that affected the actual work that you're doing?
You said you are talking about strictly lighting design? Okay. I mean, like, are you considering things like this? Because literally prior to this, I would never say I never hid that I was a black woman. I think that like I have a very sort of nuanced existence with how I look and sort of being ambiguously racial looking. And in so many of the spaces I was in, I never felt comfortable talking about that. Like it is very uncomfortable to sort of acknowledge that. Even, you know, when people talk about like why is it important for example, same-sex marriage to be like codified in law, and not because we want to talk about people's sex lives. Nobody wants to talk about that in public. They want to be able to talk about their family. They want to be able to talk about their home life. Well, you know, like I want the same thing too, but I don't want to, you know, have to then have incredibly like nuanced discussions about like racism or race or why my family struggled in one particular way or how my grandparents had to do X, Y, and Z. Like I don't want to have that conversation in spaces that don't feel safe and open and supportive. So while that has nothing particularly to do with me putting a downlight on a page, it does have something to do with how I engage in the spaces where downlights are talked about. Or, you know, I was out to dinner with a regional, with two different regionals, and was talking about my own personal discomfort as an only in a space, and had one of them immediately say, well, I would have thought they would have just seen you as a beautiful woman. Well, okay, great, like, sure, because now that stops the conversation, because my existence that I just said is now, like, has now been made irrelevant to the conversation we're having. So I can't say that it makes me put downlights on a page differently. Yet, it makes me move in spaces more comfortably. It makes me feel more of my whole self in spaces. And then all of the light privilege research we are doing about exterior lighting, that makes me feel really, really proud about our little corner of the shop and lighting equity. And you know, the best example I gave my friends who still don't entirely understand what I do was when we started on Zoom, and so many of my friends and family are dark-skinned, and they couldn't be seen on Zoom because they didn't have enough light. And like that was the first time there was an immediate connection to how they look and light were sort of brought together, other than like a school picture. You know, now there was an immediate sense when somebody understood lighting and how it was affecting them as a different person. Now, granted, that's not the same as street lighting outside, but it was a very clear way that somebody who was a non-lighting person was able to understand it. That was a really long answer, sorry.
No, you know, I would say that it starts with the conversation. So like the branding and identity exercise that we did, what I am finding from, you know, before and after the planting of the flag and through this year of practice, I'm finding a different tone and tenor to the conversations. It's a little bit hard to designate like what the outcome would have been without this and what it is now, you know. But I am starting to recognize a different dialogue around design, a healthier dialogue, especially where it's concerned with. We find ourselves in conversations where people who might not always feel comfortable to speak up quickly. It's not always good stuff, but it's always different stuff, and it's always stuff that wouldn't have been said before. And so that gets to be part of the mix. For me personally, I will tell you that one of the things that I have had the hardest time learning, but I think that I get the most out of, is really going back on anything that I have as an assumption or as an assumed direction. Because, you know, coming from and living my entire life in a position of privilege related to these groups, it's easy to confuse my way with the right way, right? And having worked for folks who are similarly privileged, at other firms, it's easy to confuse their way with the right way. And having worked for big famous architects who set the standard for a design principle or a design idea who are of a privileged group, it's easy to assume that their way is the right way. So I would say the biggest day in, day out change is that kind of mindset that starts at a really personal level but expands to, like, designers like to say that we challenge our own assumptions on a regular basis, but I think there's a level to which we don't. There's a fundamental level to where that stops, that self-reflection stops. Definitely myself, I would assume that's more common. And that's been a real change. It also emboldens us. I think that what we've started to see too is we now have the confidence to make decisions that we might have worried before would rock the boat or ruffle feathers. We will make decisions about who we work with, right? Who are the stakeholders in a given process? Who do we choose to work with if choice, where we have choice? I mean, we have, you know, some standing in our community, and that gives us the ability to make choice. We recognize that then we also have the responsibility of choice. And can we change those choices? Change those choices. So there's a lot of ways like that that I will tell you over the long term. And you know, in first year, nothing's built yet, so I don't know what the result is. You know how it goes. But I will tell you, over the long term, the success of Chromatic will be seen through that. I can already tell that that's what is going to make that difference. And that's what's so exciting. But downlights are the same.
So far.
So far. Anybody else? Please.
I'm sure that has a lot to do with it, being in Southern California. The School of Architecture in particular, over the last 5 years, under the leadership of the former dean, has had a very vocal, very loud sort of call to arms for equity, inclusion work, diversifying the curriculum, really sort of like pushing beyond what has previously been taught. And I think that has empowered the students who already felt that to be a little bit louder. I mean, you know, there's there's 500 some students in the School of Architecture, and, you know, maybe 60 of them were on that Zoom call, right? So we're only seeing a smaller, you know, percentage of the, you know, the total group, and of course the ones who show up are the ones interested in the progress that can be made in that. I mean, when we talk about it in class, I still have a second guess because I'm so unused to talking about these things in person. But the second I see a student nod, like, oh yeah, I'm like, okay, here we go. Like, one. And if there's one, then that means there's probably like 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 who are just not emoting or expressing. So I think it's possible. One, I'm sure that Southern California has for sure a difference, being an incredibly different location than Texas. And two, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who are also still uncomfortable, who have those same sort of perspectives, but may feel like the outliers in, again, a community that is, to the rest of the world, seemingly not as interested in those kinds of conversations. Is what? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the design, you know, back to what Archer's asking, like, what is the actual like design connection? So in my studio class, you know, we talk about equitable lighting applications like at night and the use of light, and so we have that. But then I also, silver lining of the pandemic, now the whole school is set up for Zooming instructors in from wherever. So now my students can see literally any kind of lighting designer who looks like them made manifest right in front of them. So they're a, you know, gender non-conforming, you know, person of color from wherever. Like I know that probably one person, right? Or I know an immigrant from China who has now like decided to start their own lighting studio, or you know, someone who's moved from another state. Like whatever that identity of that student is, if they've been willing to share any sort of non-visual cues for it, like we can have that. And what probably wouldn't have been a conversation before might be one now.
And I think it goes to the idea of creating those spaces where, you know, because, you know, I'm not a marketing and business analyst expert, but from what I've read, there is a big difference with the way people operate behind the digital screen and in front, right? And I would say that in what not I would say, but I think what we're seeing prove out from the types of companies and brands and purchases. So if we talk about purchase power for young people, they make much more open-minded decisions when they're doing it on their smartphone than maybe when they go to the local store, right? And so I think that's as much about the difference between. So I would wonder, and I don't know the fact because I wish I was a sociologist, but I'm not, but I would wonder if those ideas are there, it's just the physical space, not your class, but the physical space at large doesn't make a lot of opportunity for that talk, doesn't create a lot of safe opportunity to have those conversations. And that, you know, we will admit is a much easier hill to climb in Los Angeles than other places in the world. You know,
and specifically at USC, which is like, it's written like on, like it's literally on the wall, like equity is important, like be inclusive, use this kind of language. I'm going to do what she said I do, and grew up in Columbus, Ohio. But one of the things we always do when we're talking about stuff is I always ask if it passes the Uncle Chuck test, because my Uncle Chuck is a great guy, but if it's going to smell funny to him, then it's not quite ready for wide public yet. And he's even a businessman. Like even when I make the business cases for the things I do, if it doesn't pass the Uncle Chuck test, then I got some work to do to make my point in a way that is more easily digestible, right? And so I take that on myself, not to shy away from those conversations, but to work on the way that I communicate them, and to work on making that point and trying to win those conversations and trying to. One day Uncle Chuck's going to believe in me. I'm always going to be this big to Uncle Chuck, so we'll see. But but I think that's kind of that mentality, and yeah, it's definitely easy to say the stuff from the West Coast. We get it, but we came, we're here. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This is and look at that, Mary. Thanks.